Most people remember the Twin Towers as a skyline icon that died in a single morning, a clean symbol with a clean ending. But the towers began as a forced idea, pushed through lower Manhattan by men who wanted permanence more than permission. In the mid-1960s, 13 blocks of small shops and warehouses were cleared to make room for an empire-sized platform. Inside the new complex, vacancy stayed stubborn, money bled, and a real fire ran through the North Tower years before anyone imagined jets. Some called the place cursed. Others blamed budgets, politics, and a design that treated safety as an upgrade. A city told it must obey. The towers were sold as salvation, yet the first thing they produced was a map of who would be removed. In 1960, New York was losing its grip. Corporations drifted to the suburbs, and downtown felt tired, cramped, obsolete. David Rockefeller, chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, needed the financial district to matter again. His bank had just built a 60-story tower at One Chase Manhattan Plaza, but the surrounding blocks looked shabby. Old warehouses, low-rise buildings, streets that ended at the Hudson without ceremony. Rockefeller wanted a project so large it would force other companies to follow him back downtown. He found his partner in the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a public agency with the power to condemn land, issue bonds, and bypass city planners. The Port Authority was not elected. It answered to two governors, not voters. It could take property through eminent domain and call it progress. In March 1960, and the Port Authority announced a vision, a World Trade Center that would gather importers, exporters, and customs brokers into one superblock. Trade, they said, needed a monument. The first proposed site sat along the East River near the South Street seaport. But Rockefeller wanted the project closer to his bank. He pushed for a westward shift toward the Hudson, where land was cheaper and resistance seemed manageable. By 1962, the Port Authority had redrawn the map. The new site stretched from Church Street to West Street, Liberty Street to Vesey. 13 blocks, 60 acres when you counted the landfill they would add to the river. A platform large enough to hold not one tower, but two. Not a trade hub, but a city within a city. The agency promised jobs, tax revenue, and international prestige. Governor Nelson Rockefeller, David's brother, endorsed the plan. So did New Jersey officials, who saw the project as a symbol of regional cooperation. Critics called it a land grab dressed in civic language. Real estate developers sued, arguing the Port Authority had no right to build speculative office space. The Empire State Building's owner warned the market could not absorb 16 million square feet of new office room. But the Port Authority had legal immunity, bond financing, and two governors behind it. Public hearings became formalities. Opponents testified. The agency took notes and moved forward. In 1964, the New Jersey Supreme Court ruled the Trade Center served a valid public purpose. A year later, New York's highest court agreed. The lawsuits collapsed. Eminent domain notices went out. The question hung in the air, quiet but stubborn. Who truly benefits when public agencies build private cathedrals? The neighborhood buried under concrete. Before the steel rose, radios, repair benches, and family storefronts vanished block by block into dust. Radio Row had no grand architecture. It was Washington Street, Cortlandt Street, Day Street. Small shops crammed together, selling vacuum tubes, transistors, phonograph needles, and anything that carried a signal. Some stores were family operations going back to the 1920s, when radio was new and mysterious. Others sold war surplus, You could buy a shortwave receiver, a telegraph key, or a box of parts whose purpose you would figure out later. The owners knew each other. They competed, but they also referred customers down the block when they did not have the right component. By the early 1960s, Radio Row covered roughly 13 blocks. The Port Authority counted over 300 commercial tenants and 1,000 residents living in the apartments above. The businesses were small. Most leased their spaces. They did not have the capital or the legal team to fight a public agency. When the eviction notices arrived, owners tried to negotiate. The Port Authority offered relocation assistance, but moving costs and finding a new storefront in Lower Manhattan proved difficult. Some Dayanju accepted settlements. Others held out, hoping public opinion would shift. It did not. The trade center had momentum. In 1966, demolition crews arrived. Buildings came down in sections. Dust rose over Cortlandt Street. The small repair shops closed first, then the larger retailers. A few owners stayed until the very end, operating out of half-demolished blocks, serving customers who climbed over rubble. By 1967, the neighborhood was gone. What replaced it was a hole, the largest excavation in New York history. The foundation required digging down to bedrock, 7 stories below street level. The dirt and debris filled barges that crossed the Hudson. Some of it became landfill, extending Manhattan's western edge by several blocks. The new land would hold more of the Trade Center complex, plus parks and plazas. The project consumed the old neighborhood and then rewrote the shoreline. The Port Authority called it urban renewal. Critics called it demolition by bureaucracy. Tenant associations published lists of displaced businesses, but the media coverage focused on the towers to come, not the stores already gone. Radio Row became a footnote, a before picture, a name that survived only in nostalgia. What kind of future begins with eviction notices? 2 giants, 1 impossible promise. The towers did not rise to fit New York, they rose to dominate it, and that difference shaped every choice. The architect was Minoru Yamasaki, a man known for delicate designs and a fear of heights. The Port Authority wanted the tallest buildings in the world. Yamasaki proposed 2 identical towers, each 110 stories tall. Not a single spire, but a pair, a gateway. The towers would stand over 1,300 feet, taller than the Empire State Building, taller than anything in the skyline. The design was clean, almost austere. Vertical columns wrapped each tower in narrow aluminum bands, giving the facades a shimmering, repetitive rhythm. The columns were close together, just over a foot apart, creating the illusion of solid walls from a distance. Inside, the structural system was unconventional. Most skyscrapers used a grid of interior columns to hold up the floors. Yamasaki and the structural engineer, Leslie Robertson, designed the towers as hollow tubes. The outer walls carried most of the weight. Steel columns, 240 of them per tower, formed the perimeter. At the core, a cluster of columns supported the elevator shafts and stairwells. Between the core and the perimeter, the floors spanned open, column-free. Tenants could configure their offices however they wanted. No obstructions, maximum flexibility. The system was efficient. It was also untested at this scale. The floors were not anchored to heavy beams. They rested on lightweight trusses, thin steel bars that zigzagged between the core and the outer walls. The trusses saved weight and cost. They also made the floors vulnerable to fire. If the trusses heated and sagged, they could pull the outer columns inward, destabilizing the entire structure. But in the mid-1960s, no one designed for plane impacts or sustained fire. The towers were engineered for wind, earthquakes, and the normal loads of office life. Construction began in August 1968. The site was a staging ground for steel, concrete, and machinery. Cranes lifted columns into place. Welders worked in shifts. The foundation alone took 2 years. The slurry wall, a concrete barrier that held back the Hudson River, became an engineering marvel in its own right. It went down 70 feet, creating a bathtub that kept the excavation dry. Workers poured concrete around the clock. By 1970, the towers were visible. By 1971, they had topped out, surpassing the Empire State Building. The Port Authority held a dedication ceremony on April 4th, 1973. Ribbon cuttings, speeches about progress and global commerce. The first tenants moved in that spring. The observation deck opened in December. Tourists lined up to ride the express elevators, which climbed to the 107th floor in under a minute. The public saw a triumph. The builders believed criticism would die under height. The towers stood as proof that vision and engineering could reshape a city. They promised to anchor Lower Manhattan as the center of international finance. They promised to pay for themselves through rent. They promised safety through scale and modern design. But promises are easier to make than keep. And the real story of the World Trade Center was just beginning, when the numbers stopped behaving. The public saw a triumph, but the internal story was budgets swelling far beyond what the dream first promised. The original estimate for the World Trade Center was $350 million. By 1966, the figure had climbed to $575 million. By 1970, it was $750 million. When the towers finally opened in 1973, the total cost reached approximately $1.5 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that was over $8 billion in today's money. The Port Authority explained the overruns as necessary refinements, stronger materials, better elevators, a more complex foundation. But the pattern was clear. Every phase of construction cost more than projected, and each revision was approved quietly, without public debate. The agency financed the project through bonds, borrowing against future rent revenue. The assumption was simple: build the tallest towers in the world, and tenants would compete for space. The rent would cover the debt. But when the towers opened, the New York office market was soft. The economy had slowed. Companies were cautious. The Port Authority struggled to find tenants willing to pay premium rates for unproven space in a complex that still smelled of fresh paint. To fill the buildings, the agency moved its own offices into the towers. It leased space to New York state agencies at below market rates. By 1975, government tenants occupied roughly 30% of the complex. Private sector leasing lagged. Some floors remained empty for years. The observation deck and the restaurant, windows on the world, became the most profitable parts of the operation. Tourists paid. Businesses hesitated. The Port Authority insisted the project would eventually turn a profit, but the math was stubborn. The debt service alone consumed hundreds of millions annually. Maintenance costs for a 16 million square foot complex were staggering. Heating, cooling, security, elevators, cleaning. The towers were not just buildings. They were vertical cities, each one requiring the infrastructure of a small town. The Port Authority had underestimated operational costs the same way it had underestimated construction costs. Confidence had replaced calculation. Politically, the agency could not admit failure. The Trade Center was New York's statement to the world. Acknowledging the financial strain would undermine the governor, the mayor, and everyone who had championed the project. So, the Port Authority reframed the narrative. The towers were a long-term investment, a public good, a symbol. The balance sheet became a private concern, discussed in bond briefings, not press conferences. The original budget of $350 million had been a fantasy, a number meant to sell the vision. The true cost of $1.5 billion was the price of ego meeting reality. The gap between the two represented thousands of decisions, each one justified in the moment, each one pushing the project further from its original promise. And the question that no one wanted to answer remained. If it cannot pay for itself, what does it demand instead? Fire in the tower before fame. Years before terror entered the script, smoke climbed inside the North Tower and exposed what the building still lacked. It started on the 11th floor of the North Tower, just after midnight on February 13th, 1975. A fire broke out in a storage room filled with paper, furniture, and office supplies. The flames spread quickly, feeding on combustible materials and moving through gaps in the floor. Smoke rose through the elevator shafts, reaching floors above. The fire department responded within minutes, but the scale of the building complicated everything. Standard hoses could not reach the upper floors. Firefighters had to carry equipment up the stairwells, fighting exhaustion and heat. The fire climbed to the 19th floor before crews contained it. It burned for over 3 hours. 6 people were injured. The damage was significant, but the greater revelation was structural. The World Trade Center, the most modern office complex in the world, did not have a comprehensive sprinkler system. Some floors had partial coverage, others had none. The building's fire safety plan relied on compartmentalization and stairwell access. The assumption was that fires would stay localized and people would evacuate quickly. The 1975 fire proved that assumption wrong. Smoke moved faster than people. The open floor plans, designed for tenant flexibility, allowed fire to spread horizontally. The lightweight floor trusses, efficient in construction, were vulnerable to heat. The Port Authority faced a choice: retrofit the entire complex with sprinklers or continue relying on compartmentalization and hope. Retrofitting was expensive. The towers had over 200 floors combined. Installing sprinklers meant opening ceilings, running pipes, and disrupting tenants. The Port Authority delayed. Engineers studied the problem. Committees met. Years passed. By the early 1980s, the agency began installing sprinklers floor by floor, a process that took over a decade. By 2001, most floors had coverage, but the system was still incomplete in some areas. The 1975 fire became office lore. People who worked in the towers mentioned it casually, the way you mention a close call that did not repeat. The story circulated but did not spark outrage. The building survived. No one died. The Port Authority made improvements, slowly, and the incident faded into the background of daily operations. But the fire had exposed something important. The towers looked indestructible from the outside. Inside, they were systems held together by maintenance schedules, retrofit plans, and assumptions about normal use. The building's safety depended on details most people never saw and few wanted to pay for: fire suppression, fireproofing on the steel trusses, stairwell access, emergency communication. These were upgrades, not essentials, and they competed with other budget priorities. The fire was a warning. It said the building's strength was conditional. It said scale did not equal resilience. But warnings are only useful if people act on them. The Port Authority acted, eventually, but the timeline stretched long enough that the fire stopped feeling urgent. The towers became a landmark, a tourist destination, a profitable observation deck. The 1975 fire became a trivia question, not a turning point. How many warnings does a monument get before people stop calling them flukes? The fatal bargain called cost-cutting. The towers looked indestructible, yet their strength depended on details most people never saw and few wanted to pay for. The structural system of the Twin Towers was brilliant in its efficiency and fragile in its execution. The tube design reduced the amount of steel needed compared to a traditional skyscraper. The lightweight floor trusses cut costs and construction time. But efficiency comes with trade-offs. The trusses were thin, but they relied on fireproofing to maintain their strength during a fire. The fireproofing was sprayed on, a mixture of minerals and binding agents applied in layers. It was cheap, it was fast, it was also brittle. During construction, quality control for the fireproofing was inconsistent. Some areas received thicker coats than others. Inspections were limited. The assumption was that normal office fires would not generate enough heat to compromise the steel. The building codes of the 1960s did not anticipate the kind of catastrophic damage that would occur 3 decades later. The Port Authority followed the standards of the time, but those standards were written for a different era. The National Institute of Standards and Technology would later study the collapse of the towers. Their findings were detailed and unsettling. That the plane impacts on September 11, 2001, dislodged significant amounts of fireproofing from the floor trusses. The jet fuel fires that followed reached temperatures over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The exposed steel softened. The trusses sagged. As they sagged, they pulled the outer columns inward. The perimeter walls, which carried most of the building's weight, began to bow. When the columns failed, the floors above collapsed. The weight of the collapsing floors overwhelmed the structure below. The towers came down in sequences that took less than 2 hours from impact to total collapse. The NIST report did not call the design flawed. It called it vulnerable under extreme conditions. The towers were built to withstand typical office fires, earthquakes, and high winds. They were not built to survive the impact of a wide-body jet traveling at high speed, followed by sustained fires fed by thousands of gallons of fuel. No skyscraper of that era was, but the lightweight trusses and the sprayed-on fireproofing created a chain of failure that was documented, measurable, and tragically predictable once the conditions were known. Some called the towers cursed. They pointed to the displacement of Radio Row, the 1975 fire, the 1993 bombing, and the final collapse. They saw a pattern of misfortune, as if the site itself rejected the ambition forced upon it. Others saw human decisions, budget constraints that led to sprayed fireproofing instead of more robust alternatives, design choices that prioritized cost over redundancy, and maintenance schedules that lagged behind the building's needs. The curse narrative was compelling because it absolved responsibility. If the towers were doomed from the start, then no one was to blame. The collapse became fate, not consequence. But the NIST findings told a different story. The buildings failed because the conditions exceeded their design limits. The design limits existed because of choices made in the 1960s, when the budget was expanding but still finite, when safety standards were different, and when no one imagined a scenario that combined impact, fire, and structural failure on such a scale. The towers became a landmark too symbolic to question honestly. Admitting vulnerability would undermine the project's legacy. Upgrading the fireproofing across 200 floors would cost millions and require shutting down sections of the complex. The Port Authority made incremental improvements, but the fundamental fragility remained. The building's public image was strength. Its private reality was compromise. The fatal bargain was this: build the tallest towers in the world, but cut costs wherever possible. Use lightweight materials. Apply fireproofing as a coating, not a barrier. Trust that extreme events would remain theoretical. The bargain worked for 3 decades, and then it did not. The towers become a target. Once the complex stood for global finance, it also stood as a message board for anyone seeking spectacle. The World Trade Center was designed to represent international commerce, but symbols attract more than admiration. By the 1980s, the towers had become an icon visible from every approach to Manhattan. They marked the skyline. They appeared in films, postcards, and corporate logos. They stood for American capitalism, globalization, and the concentration of financial power. For some, that made them a beacon. For others, a target. On February 26, 1993, a truck bomb exploded in the underground parking garage beneath the North Tower. The blast killed 6 people and injured over 1,000. The bomb, built from urea nitrate and fuel, was intended to topple one tower into the other. The structural engineer, Leslie Robertson, had designed the towers to withstand such an impact, but the bombers underestimated the building's strength. The explosion created a crater several stories deep, but the towers remained standing. The attack exposed vulnerabilities in security and emergency planning. The garage had minimal surveillance. Access was easy. The bombing prompted the Port Authority to install vehicle barriers, improve lighting, and increase security patrols. But the complex remained a public space, with over 50,000 workers and 200,000 visitors daily. Securing a site that large, that open, and that symbolic was a logistical puzzle without a perfect solution. The 1993 bombing was not an isolated incident. In 1974, a man had parachuted from the South Tower. In 1975, a tightrope walker named Philippe Petit crossed between the towers on a cable. These stunts were acts of spectacle, not violence, but they demonstrated how difficult it was to control access to a building designed to welcome the world. The towers were meant to be open, democratic, a monument to free enterprise. That openness was also a weakness. By the late 1990s, security analysts warned that the towers remained a likely target for future attacks. The building's symbolism had only grown. The collapse of the Soviet Union had reordered global politics. Terrorism had shifted from state-sponsored operations to decentralized networks. The World Trade Center represented everything those networks opposed: Western capitalism, globalization, American influence. The Port Authority increased security measures, but there were limits to what could be done without fundamentally changing the nature of the complex. The towers were prisoners of their own success, and they needed to be accessible to function as a trade center. They needed to accommodate thousands of people moving in and out daily. Turning them into fortresses would undermine their purpose. So, security remained a balancing act. Metal detectors in the lobbies, ID checks for after-hours access, cameras in the parking areas. But no system could stop a determined attacker with enough planning and resources. The building's public meaning had hardened. It was no longer just an office complex. It was a statement, a symbol of American economic dominance. And symbols, by their nature, invite response. When symbolism grows, does safety shrink? The deal signed in the shadow. In the summer of 2001, a 99-year lease turned the complex into a prize just weeks before history struck. For decades, the Port Authority had owned and operated the World Trade Center. The complex was a public asset, built with public bonds, managed by a government agency. But by the late 1990s, the political calculus had shifted. The towers were profitable, generating over $400 million in annual revenue. The Port Authority wanted to monetize that value. Privatizing the lease would bring in a lump sum payment, reduce operational responsibilities, and transfer financial risk to a private entity. In July 2001, the Port Authority signed a 99-year lease with Silverstein Properties, a real estate development firm led by Larry Silverstein. The lease covered the Twin Towers, the Marriott Hotel, and several other buildings in the complex. The deal was valued at $3.2 billion, the most expensive real estate transaction in New York history at the time. Silverstein agreed to pay the Port Authority $120 million annually, with the lease running until 2099. The transaction transformed the site. It was no longer just a public monument. It was a private investment. Silverstein planned to renovate the buildings, upgrade the infrastructure, and increase rents. He secured insurance coverage for the complex, policies that would later become the subject of lengthy legal disputes. The lease closed on July 24, 2001. Silverstein took control. 7 weeks later, the towers were gone. The lease revealed how the site functioned as an asset more than a place. The $3.2 billion valuation was based on projected revenue from rent, retail, and the observation deck. The complex generated income from over 10 million square feet of office space, plus restaurants, shops, and event facilities. The daily human flow was staggering. 50,000 employees, 200,000 visitors, subway lines running beneath the complex, path trains connecting to New Jersey. The World Trade Center was not just a pair of towers. It was a transportation hub, a retail district, and an employment center compressed into 16 acres. The operational complexity was immense. The buildings required constant maintenance. Elevators, HVAC systems, electrical infrastructure, plumbing, security, cleaning. The cost of running the complex exceeded $100 million annually. Silverstein inherited that responsibility along with the revenue stream. He also inherited the symbolic weight. The towers were not just real estate. They were history, politics, and public memory embedded in steel and concrete. The lease was a bet on stability. Silverstein assumed the towers would stand for the next 99 years. He assumed the market would remain strong. He assumed the risks were manageable. Those assumptions lasted 7 weeks. Who owns responsibility when a public monument becomes a private bet? A morning that exposed every compromise. When the planes hit, the towers did not just burn. They revealed how fragile certainty becomes under heat and chaos. The first plane struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. on September 11, 2001. American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767, hit between the 93rd and 99th floors. The impact severed columns, destroyed stairwells, and ignited thousands of gallons of jet fuel. People above the impact zone were trapped. The stairwells were blocked. The elevators were inoperable. Smoke filled the upper floors. 17 minutes later, the second plane hit the South Tower. United Airlines Flight 175 struck between the 78th and 84th floors. The impact was off-center, damaging more of the building's core than the first strike. fire spread quickly. The floors above the impact zone began to sag. People jumped from windows. The scene was chaos, grief, and disbelief compressed into minutes. The towers were designed to survive the impact of a Boeing 707, the largest commercial jet in service when the buildings were conceived. But a 767 carries more fuel, flies faster, and weighs more. In the impacts dislodged fireproofing from the steel trusses. The fires burned hotter than the designers had anticipated. The lightweight floor trusses began to fail. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. The top floors fell first, their weight crushing the structure below. The collapse took less than 10 seconds. The North Tower stood for another 29 minutes, then followed the same pattern. The floors pancaked. The outer walls buckled. The buildings came down in clouds of dust that swallowed Lower Manhattan. The evacuation was incomplete. Thousands escaped, but the stairwells were narrow. 3 stairwells per tower, each just 44 inches wide, designed to meet code minimums. The buildings could hold over 20,000 people, but the evacuation system was built for orderly, incremental exit, not mass flight. When the planes hit, the stairwells became bottlenecks. People moved slowly, single file, descending from floors that were over 1,000 feet in the air. Emergency communication failed. The radios used by the fire department could not reach the upper floors. The public address system was damaged. People on the highest floors did not receive clear instructions. Some stayed in their offices, waiting for rescue. Others tried to descend and encountered smoke, heat, and blocked paths. The building's emergency plan assumed that help would arrive. It did not account for the scale of the damage or the speed of the collapse. The NIST investigation later documented the sequence. The plane impacts severed structural columns. The fires weakened the floor trusses. The trusses sagged and pulled the outer walls inward. The perimeter columns buckled. The floors above fell. The weight of the collapsing floors created a cascading failure. The towers were not brought down by the impact alone. They were brought down by fire, heat, and the compounding stress on a structural system that depended on every piece holding. Some people spoke of a curse. They pointed to the history, the displacement, the 1975 fire, the 1993 bombing, the final collapse. They saw a pattern, a cycle of misfortune tied to the ambition that birthed the project. Others pointed to the mechanics, the lightweight trusses, the sprayed fireproofing, the design choices made in the 1960s, the budget compromises, the security lapses, the emergency plans that assumed less severe scenarios. The curse narrative offered closure. It suggested the towers were doomed, us that nothing could have saved them. The documented mechanics offered something harder to accept. The collapse was preventable, but only if the risks had been understood and addressed decades earlier. The truth was somewhere in between. The buildings failed because the conditions exceeded their limits, and those limits were set by human choices, not fate. The collapse was the final invoice for decades of decisions. Design efficiency over structural redundancy, cost control over comprehensive fireproofing, symbolic value over honest vulnerability. The towers had promised permanence. They delivered spectacle, then rubble. The ruins become a marketplace. After the dust settled, grief met procurement, and the site became a battleground of contracts, memory, and control. The cleanup began within hours of the collapse. The site was a disaster zone. Steel beams twisted into sculptures of heat and force. Concrete pulverized into powder. Fires smoldered underground for weeks. The recovery operation was vast, dangerous, and urgent. Workers searched for survivors, then for remains. Heavy machinery moved debris. Trucks carried the wreckage to barges, which transported it to a landfill on Staten Island, where every piece was examined. The site covered 16 acres, the same footprint the original complex had occupied. The Port Authority still owned the land. Silverstein Properties still held the lease. Insurance companies faced billions in claims. Architects proposed memorials. Developers proposed new towers. Families of the victims demanded sacred ground. The city needed tax revenue. Everyone had a claim. The rebuilding debate exposed competing visions of legacy. Some argued the site should remain a memorial, a place of reflection and mourning. Others insisted that rebuilding was the only appropriate response, a statement that terror would not erase commerce or ambition. The Port Authority leaned toward reconstruction. Silverstein wanted to rebuild because his lease obligated him to restore the property. The insurance policies became the subject of lawsuits that lasted years. The central question: was the attack one event or two? The answer determined whether Silverstein could claim coverage once or twice, a difference of billions. The site generated over $400 million in annual revenue before the attacks. The complex had housed over 430 companies. The daily foot traffic supported hundreds of retail businesses, restaurants, and transit connections. The original World Trade Center was not just an office park. It was an economic engine. Rebuilding meant restoring that function, but it also meant confronting what the site had become: a mass grave, a political symbol, and a tourist destination. The design process was public and contentious. Daniel Libeskind's master plan won the initial competition, proposing a memorial, a museum, and a new tower that would rise to 1,776 feet, a symbolic height referencing the year of American independence. Silverstein hired his own architect, David Childs, to design the main tower. The two visions clashed. Compromises were negotiated. The final design kept the symbolic height, but altered the aesthetics. Construction on the new tower, eventually named One World Trade Center, began in 2006. The memorial opened on the 10th anniversary of the attacks. The museum followed in 2014. The new tower was completed in 2014, though full occupancy took years. The rebuilding stretched over a decade, a timeline shaped by lawsuits, budget disputes, and the challenge of building on a site that remained emotionally charged. The site's acreage and its daily human flow before the attacks illustrated the scale of what was lost. 16 acres, 50,000 workers, 200,000 daily visitors, subway and PATH train access. The complex had been a vertical city, condensed into a platform that redefined Lower Manhattan. Rebuilding that capacity required not just new towers, but new infrastructure, new security measures, and a new relationship between public memory and private profit. The ruins had become a marketplace where grief, commerce, and politics negotiated the future. The question was not whether to rebuild, but what the rebuilding would say about the values that survived the collapse. The myth that replaced the truth. People reach for curses when the real causes feel too human, too bureaucratic, and too easy to repeat. The curse of the World Trade Center became a story people told to make sense of tragedy. It started with Radio Row. 300 businesses displaced, a neighborhood erased. Some said the site was cursed from the moment the first eviction notice was served. The 1975 fire seemed to confirm the pattern. Then the 1993 bombing. Then the final collapse. Each event fed the narrative. The towers, according to the curse, were built on injustice and could never stand. The curse story was compelling because it offered a narrative arc. Beginning, middle, end. Cause, consequence, collapse. It suggested that the towers were always doomed, that their fall was preordained. It absolved everyone of responsibility. If the site was cursed, then no decision could have changed the outcome. The displacement, the budget overruns, the design compromises, the security lapses, none of it mattered. The towers were fated to fail. But the record tells a different story. The displacement of Radio Row was a political decision, enabled by eminent domain laws and justified through urban renewal rhetoric. The businesses could have been relocated with better planning and more generous compensation. The neighborhood could have been preserved or incorporated into a smaller project. The decision to clear 13 blocks was not inevitable. It was chosen. The 1975 fire exposed the lack of a comprehensive sprinkler system. The Port Authority responded, but slowly. The retrofit took over a decade. By 2001, most floors had coverage, but the system was still incomplete. The delay was not a curse. It was a budget decision, a prioritization of other expenditures over fire safety infrastructure. The 1993 bombing revealed security vulnerabilities. The complex was too open, too accessible, and too symbolic. Improvements were made, but the fundamental challenge remained. How do you secure a public space designed to welcome the world? The Port Authority tried, but there were limits to what could be done without transforming the towers into fortresses. The bombing was not fate. It was a consequence of the building's public nature and the difficulty of defending a target that large. The structural failure on September 11th was documented by NIST. The planes dislodged fireproofing. The fires weakened the trusses. The floors collapsed. The design choices made in the 1960s, efficient but vulnerable, created the conditions for cascading failure. The collapse was not mystical. It was mechanical, measurable, and tragically predictable under the circumstances. The curse narrative protected reputations by hiding decisions. It turned a complex history of displacement, politics, budgets, and safety compromises into a simple story of bad luck. It allowed people to mourn without accountability. But myths, however comforting, obscure the lessons that might prevent repetition. The truth is less tidy than the curse. The towers were conceived in ambition, built through political maneuvering, compromised by cost controls, and destroyed by a combination of terror and structural vulnerability. Each phase involved choices. Those choices had consequences. The curse offers closure. The record offers responsibility. The towers were not doomed from the start. They were fragile because fragility was built into them, layer by layer, decision by decision. Understanding that difference matters because it means the next monument, the next project, the next public undertaking can choose differently. Or it can ignore the record and hope for better luck. What we build to outrun death. The Twin Towers asked to be remembered forever, and they were, but not in the way their makers rehearsed. Monuments are promises. They promise to outlast their creators, to carry meaning forward, to anchor memory in steel and stone. The World Trade Center made that promise louder than most. 2 towers, identical, taller than anything that came before. A statement that commerce, ambition, and engineering could rewrite the skyline and the city beneath it. The towers promised permanence, they delivered something else. They delivered displacement for 300 businesses and 1,000 residents who lived on land the Port Authority wanted. They delivered a construction project that cost over $1 billion more than projected, financed by bonds that future generations would repay. And they delivered a complex that struggled to fill its floors, survived a major fire, and became a target because its symbolism outgrew its security. The towers were a monument to ambition that needed a skyline to feel real. David Rockefeller wanted downtown to matter again. The Port Authority wanted a legacy project. Governor Nelson Rockefeller wanted a symbol of regional cooperation. The towers gave them what they wanted, but the cost was distributed unevenly. The displaced shopkeepers paid first. The taxpayers paid through bond debt. The workers and visitors on September 11th paid last. Ego demands a monument, but ordinary people pay first. That is the pattern. The neighborhood cleared to make room. The budget overruns absorbed by public agencies. The safety retrofits delayed because they competed with other priorities. The emergency plans that assumed manageable scenarios. The towers stood for 30 years, long enough for most people to forget the compromises that made them possible. Long enough for the buildings to feel inevitable, permanent, safe. But nothing built by humans is permanent. Everything depends on maintenance, investment, and honest assessment of risk. The towers were maintained, but incompletely. They were invested in, but selectively. The risks were assessed, but optimistically. When the conditions exceeded the design limits, the buildings failed. The legacy of the World Trade Center is not just the collapse. It is the entire arc, the cleared neighborhood, the fragile engineering, the global wound, the rebuilding debates, the memorial that tries to hold grief and commerce in the same 16 acres. The story is about what happens when a city builds to prove itself, when public agencies wield private ambitions, and when monuments become too symbolic to question. The towers are gone, but the site remains. One World Trade Center stands 1,776 feet tall, a number chosen for its meaning, not its function. The memorial pools occupy the footprints of the original towers. The museum preserves artifacts. The site still attracts millions of visitors. It still generates revenue. It still carries the weight of history. The question the towers leave behind is this: what are we willing to sacrifice for permanence? What compromises do we accept when ambition demands a monument? The answers are in the record: the displacement, the costs, the fires, the delays, the decisions that treated safety as negotiable. The towers were not cursed. They were built, operated, and destroyed by human choices. History collects the rest. It collects the rubble, the lawsuits, the memorials, and the lessons. Some lessons are learned. Others are ignored. The World Trade Center teaches that monuments are fragile, that symbols invite response, and that the tallest towers still fall when the foundation is compromised. The towers ask to be remembered forever. They are. But memory is not the same as permanence. Memory is the story we tell about what was lost, what was risked, and what we choose to build next.